First Daniel. There's only one Daniel.
Not to be confused with second or third Daniel.
No. You're starting this one, right?
Yeah, I was getting comfortable.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Welcome to the Lacey Brothers Show. I'm Ryan.
I'm Jonathan. Didn't know we were doing names this time.
I wanted to do it like that. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about things and stuff, and you go ahead whenever you're ready, John.
Quite the intro today. Okay. Jeez. Okay, today we're going to be talking about His will, the Lord's will versus man's will, and how that looks and kind of what we can draw from that throughout certain stories in the Bible. So we're going to be starting with 1 Daniel. 1 Daniel. There's only one Daniel.
Not to be confused with second or third Daniel.
No. Okay, so we're starting with Daniel. Chapter 1, verse 1 is what I was going for. So, this says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Yeah. So, the important thing we're looking at here is the beginning of verse 2, when it says, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, referring to Nebuchadnezzar. So the Lord is the one that is putting Nebuchadnezzar in this place over now Judah and Jerusalem. He's the one putting him in that position because he's handing Jehoiakim over into his hand. So God is already putting Nebuchadnezzar into this position. And that is the first thing that I want to point out because that's super important going forward. So now we are going to skip ahead. We're going to skip his first dream and stuff like that. We're going straight into Daniel 3, and we're looking at verses 1 through 7. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 6 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all other provincial officials, there we go, to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. In these 7 verses, the phrase King Nebuchadnezzar had set up is said 5 different times. So why is Scripture trying to reiterate that Nebuchadnezzar had set this up? And this is where we look back at Daniel 1. The Lord placed Nebuchadnezzar in this position. It makes it very clear, and it states that because he wants us to know that Nebuchadnezzar was placed there because of the Lord. The Lord puts him there. Now it's making it very clear that Nebuchadnezzar, it is his will that is building this image and telling people to bow down and worship it. It's creating a complete contrast between the Lord's will and Nebuchadnezzar rising to power and how Nebuchadnezzar is using this power. The Lord might have put them there, but Nebuchadnezzar is not acting on the Lord's will now. And it's creating a very clear distinction here. So, it's Nebuchadnezzar's will to punish people that don't bow down and worship him, that don't give him glory. So then Daniel 3, 13 and 14. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" So basically, they were caught not bowing down and worshiping. That's why Nebuchadnezzar, and he's calling them because he's angry, because why? Again, they aren't bowing down and worshiping. He's not getting glory like he wants from his will. And then we see the resolution of this entire story, right? So we've seen God's will of putting him in that position, and then we've seen Nebuchadnezzar's will, which is forcing people to worship him and give him the glory. We see the resolution in Daniel 3:16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." These three men knew the consequences of disobeying King Nebuchadnezzar, of disobeying this decree to bow down and worship him. But that's not the will of their God. That's not the will of their king, of the true king, the King of Kings. They knew the will of God, not King Nebuchadnezzar's. So they accept the punishment for this. The punishment of the government in charge at that time, they accept it, and they get thrown into the furnace. And whenever they're in there, King Nebuchadnezzar sees, and he's like, "Hold on, didn't we throw 3 men in there? And other guys," because the guards that threw those 3 in were killed because the furnace was so hot. So other guys were like, "Yeah, like you threw 3 guys in there." Then Nebuchadnezzar basically says, "Then why do I see 4 men walking around in there?" So he gets them out. They're fine. They don't even smell singed. And they give glory to God because God delivered them from the fiery furnace, the blazing furnace, whichever translation you have.
You know how smug my walkout would have been? Like, I just got thrown in the furnace. Not a thing happened to me. They would have heard about it while I was headed out of that furnace.
Like,
you know?
It would have been very clear that King Nebuchadnezzar did not have all the power that he thought he had.
No, I would have pushed the statue down on my way out, out the furnace.
So that's the first example, right? We've seen Nebuchadnezzar's will. We see the Lord's will. And the Lord is his will is inevitable. It's going to happen. He's going to get glory from every situation. So the next example is just a little bit later in Daniel. We're staying in Daniel, and it's a display of Daniel choosing God's will over man's, over the governors, or the governing authority, should I say. So the king, Nebuchadnezzar, was going to place Daniel over the whole kingdom because he had established himself, because of his good qualities, over the other satraps and administration, right? Like, he had done phenomenal, and the king's like, "You know what? You're getting a raise. You're getting what's it called when you move up?
Promotion. There
Thanks."
you go.
So he was going to get a promotion. And the other satraps, the other administrations, they weren't thrilled about it, right? They're not happy. So they basically come together and they're like, "You know what? Let's get him in trouble. Like, let's find him doing something wrong, and then he'll get in trouble and he won't get this promotion." The problem was, Daniel hadn't done anything wrong. So they think about it and they're like, he follows this other god, and he follows all the rules that this other god apparently has. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to explain that we want to make a decree, or we want you to make a decree. So Nebuchadnezzar signs a decree that for the next 30 days, you can't pray to any other god or man other than him. And if you do, you get thrown in the lion's den. So he signs that and publishes that decree, right? Daniel 6:10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, so he knows about the punishment, he knows about the new decree in place, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he did before. He does not care about the consequences of this governing authority. He respects it, but the consequences are still nothing to him because he knows the Lord's will. And he still chooses to bow down to the only King of Kings. So, of course, these other satraps and administrations, they see him praying because the window's open, I assume. So they see him, they go to Nebuchadnezzar, of course, and they're like, hey, this dude's still praying. So Nebuchadnezzar throws him into the lion's den, even though he didn't want to. It even says that Nebuchadnezzar, thinking about it, realized that decrees can't be gone back against. They can't just be undone. So he throws Daniel in. The next morning, Nebuchadnezzar rushes to the den where Daniel had been thrown in with the lions. And he shouts out, Daniel, has your Lord spared you or saved you, whatever term it uses, from the lions? And Daniel responds, Your Majesty, yes, my Lord has spared me from this. He sent an angel which bound the lions' mouths. And Daniel's fine. And then Nebuchadnezzar finds the guys that tattletailed, and he throws them in, and they're devoured. But then you still see the resolution of God's will in... I didn't write down the verse, of course not, because that would have been too handy. Later, Nebuchadnezzar writes a letter, right? He writes to people of all nations, of all tongues, and proclaims the glory of Daniel's God. Even in this, when Nebuchadnezzar makes a decision that he doesn't technically want to, because he wants to go back on it, but he still makes a decision against God's will, and God still gets glory from it. Through everything, God is getting glory from these situations. So then there's one more example that Ryan is going to go through, and it is back in Exodus, referring to like Pharaoh and Moses.
No, I don't want to do it today.
So that's the Lazy Brothers podcast.
All right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it.
Okay.
I want to do it. So, also, one last side note on Daniel is that I have two middle names, and one of them is Daniel. So, now we're going to Exodus.
That's why you only got Exodus. Stuff like that.
Exodus 9:16. And just what we're going to be talking about is Pharaoh and Moses and the standoff, right? So, if you're familiar with the story, Moses is told by God to go approach Pharaoh and tell him he has to let his people go. And then he sings that song right in his face.
Loud.
Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Oh, baby, let my people go. Yeah. And also, I don't really believe he sang that song in Pharaoh's face, okay? Because I know we're going to get an email be like, actually, he didn't really. Thank you. I didn't go to seminary, okay? So I assumed. What we're going to use from this is the fact that Pharaoh was put into that position, just like Nebuchadnezzar, to glorify God. If you look at Exodus 9:16, it says, this is God speaking of Pharaoh. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Right? Pharaoh's placed in this position. God knows he is going to oppose him. And when I say oppose him, it's because from Pharaoh's end, he thinks he's opposing God. On God's end, he's like, yep, this is exactly what I knew was going to happen, and that's why I placed you in this position. So don't think, it's funny, we talked about it at church this morning, God has no rival, and oftentimes we think about this as if Pharaoh rose up and was rivaling God. No, he was doing exactly what God had created him to do, right? He made those choices, so God's like, you're going to glorify me. He was like, you can pretend you're opposing me or whatever, but I'm going to be glorified through this situation. That's why I put you in that position of power. Then you contrast that with Moses, who is also being used by God, placed in the position he is in, only he is in alignment with God's will. This is going to come together to glorify God. That's the whole purpose of this. So when you get down to Exodus 14, verse 30, 31, here's what they say. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw that the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This was the inevitable, undenying outcome of what was going to happen. God was going to be glorified. Even though Pharaoh was acting against God and his will, or thought he was doing his best to do that, God's will not be thwarted. It will be carried out and it will be accomplished. Now, how we personally go about it is going to be our choices. But make no mistake about it, our life is going to glorify God in the end. Right? and at the very end of our lives, every knee will bow, regardless. You will submit to the will of God. So the question for us is, do I want to go against God's will like Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh? It seemed to end really well for them. Or do I want to fall more in line with the Hebrew boys, Daniel, Moses, and let God use me in accordance to his will? Because even if we are butting against God's will and we're still going to glorify him, we're not going to be satisfied because we're trying to oppose him. We're going outside of his will. So if his will is going to be carried out anyways, why not submit to that will and live in a joy and a peaceful life being used by him? The last point I want to make here is I want to go to Romans 13, okay? Because this chapter in specific, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. If you get free time, go read the chapter. If you don't have free time to read just one chapter of the Bible, I would quit doing some stuff in your life. Like, I don't know what is jam-packing your schedule. Just free up a bit of it, okay? So, Romans 13 talks about our officials. I'm just going to read the verse 1, and you'll get the idea. It's the whole chapter. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This is a perfect example. I've given one example. John gave an example. These people were put in place by God. Our authorities, our governments are put in place by God, and we must respect that. Now, what a lot of people use Romans 13 is for whatever side they fall on politically. They will say if the government does something in their favor and the other side's opposing that, they're going to be like, no. Romans 13 says that you have to obey everything the government says. I am here to tell you that is not true. That is not what Romans 13 says. And we have two examples of the Bible contradicting that notion. Right here, Nebuchadnezzar, with Daniel and 3 Hebrew boys. They respected the authority, and that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to respect our government and our authorities. It's a gift from God. God has placed them in authority. But when their law or their rules comes into contradiction or at loggerheads with God's, we have to err on the side of God's will. That is what we as Christians are supposed to do. So it's not the government, we have to do everything they say. No, we stand for God's will and we accept the punishment if there's a consequence for that. That's our examples we have. Some people also want to be like, no, if it's not right and it goes against God's will, we must rise up and overthrow and fight the government. I don't see that biblically at all. I just don't. I see that we are supposed to be subject to it. We accept these consequences and these punishments. Now, I'm not talking about America. Please don't confuse what I'm saying right now. I'm not saying, well, America's trying to take our guns. We're not supposed to do anything. America works very different than any other country, and that's a whole thing for another time. I'm simply saying when it comes to this subject here. So, in closing this, my advice, my best application is, if you want to err on the side of God's will when it comes to your life glorifying God, is you better know what his will is. For your life specifically too. There is the universal will where we're supposed to worship him and glorify him. And then the Great Commission, we're supposed to share. But then our specific will from our lives of how we go about glorifying him and maybe our ministry position stuff. I can't give that to you. You have to be spending time. Like I said, you better clear up some time to read a couple chapters. Spend time with God. And let him show you his will. See what he is doing. See what his will looks like. Because if not, you could be going against his will and not even realize it. Not even understanding. And that's a dangerous position to be on, as we've seen. So, with that being said, that's all we have today. Thank you for tuning in. And also, happy Labor Day.
Yeah.
Labor Day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Nice.